Okay, so we're talking about your podcast. You set your consultation. We're on the phone. You came into the office, and the first thing I want to know is what is your podcast all about? What are we talking about? Who are we talking to? And what are they going to be listening to? I mean, that's the biggest part. Podcast is a lot of audio things going on. It's conversation. And that's the first thing we want to talk about. And you don't even have to worry if you just know that, hey, I have good conversation. I want to start a podcast. That's all I know at this point. That's cool, because what we'll do is we'll sit down and create a show format. I mean, you probably listen to podcasts. You see how either organized they are or unorganized they are. You have some podcasts that are just running conversation, which is cool. That's works for their audience and their programming. You have other podcasts that have certain segments, certain sections of topics that they'll be talking about, which is a particular format as well. That's what we'll be talking about. Do you have a format? Do you not have a format? Do you want a format? Is that something that you want your show to be based off of? We'll sit down and break down your show. We have excellent experts here who understand entertainment. They understand the process of putting together a show. I myself understand the process of putting together a show. So that's the first thing we'll be talking about. What are you talking about? How is your show going to be formatted? What type of podcast we're going to be pursuing? You have certain podcasts where it's just you, the camera, microphone. You're talking directly to your audience, kind of like I am now. You also have a format where you bring in people and you interview them, you talk to them, you guys are collaborating in conversation. So that's just something that we'll be discussing as well. That way we can make sure that we have the capability to produce your podcast the way you have envisioned it. That's literally the first step. Okay, now one cool thing about recording your podcast at Remarkable Six Studios is that we have this cool green screen room. This makes sure that everybody has a custom look to their podcast. I mean, why would you want the same look as so and so podcast that came in an hour before you, or another podcast that records here? You have the same chairs and background, and no, everybody has a custom look. Okay, one thing that we'll be talking about is the frequency of your podcast shows. Like, how often do you want to release shows to your audience? How long do you want those episodes to be? I mean, that helps us to create a tailored package that fits, for one, your podcast needs, but also kind of helps us understand, how often we need to record episodes, how quick those turnaround times need to be with the editing, so that we can make sure that we're keeping up with the frequency of your podcast shows. I tell a lot of my beginning podcasters, you don't have to give them a whole hour and a half episode. Sometimes you can start off giving them micro episodes, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15-minute episodes, so that your audience gets used to your podcasting, and as your show grows, you lengthen the time of your episodes. As your audience builds, you give them more episodes to keep up with the demand that your audience wants to see you. But the frequency is definitely part of our conversation when it comes down to sculpting your podcast production. Now to some more fun stuff, the branding elements. Like, this is like really fun for me. I like this part. But the branding elements, your logo to your podcast, do you have a website? Do you have brand colors? Like, that's all the marketing aspect, the strategy behind your podcast. Because keep in mind, we want you to have a successful podcast. And for a successful podcast, you need those branding elements in place. That's just how it is. You want some type of organization to your look. You want your audience to get used to your look and the way you construct things. And if you're gonna come in Remarkable Six Studios for your podcast, you're gonna get grade A work. So we're gonna make sure the look of things is correct. We have the right color elements within your podcast when your name pops up, where your Instagram handle shows, where your logo to your podcast shows. If your logo is animated, do you have a website where people can refer back to, or a nice social media platform where people can refer back to, so that your audience starts to build? So that's just conversation that we have, those branding elements. We want to make sure that everything is in place so that you have a professional, polished podcast production. Bang. That was like kind of hard. Professional, polished podcast production. Man, I'm getting good at this. Okay, so let's talk about the audio, the visual. Let's talk about that because you get both formats here at Remarkable Six Studios. You know, when I'm in the gym in the morning, I'm usually, I have my headphones in. I'm listening to the audio version of a podcast. I'm probably on a podcast app and I'm just, getting my pump on. I'm listening to the audio version. By the time I get to work, I'm probably putting YouTube up on the TV, YouTube on my computer, and I'm I'm watching and listening to the visual portion of a podcast. I'm watching people converse, listening to them converse. But here you get both formats. You get your MP4 that you can load to YouTube and you can monetize that. You also get your MP3 format as well, so that you can send over to Spotify, you can send to iHeartRadio, you can send over to the Apple Podcast app, so that you have full exposure for your podcast. This is a common theme. We want to build your audience. We want you to have a successful podcast career. So in order for us to do that, we want to make sure that we're utilizing every platform when it comes down to your podcast production. So you get your MP4 visual and audio, you get your MP3 audio, and you're set up for a successful podcast career. Monetizing your podcast. Monetizing your podcast. And I mean, it's only right we have those conversations. Honestly, I feel as though your podcast production, your podcast process, your podcast career needs to be an investment to you and not an expense to you. So we talk about different ways where you can monetize your podcast. You can have your podcast pay for itself and some. When it comes down to watch hours on YouTube and optimizing your videos so that more people can come in contact with it. When it comes down to maybe friends or that you may know with products or services that will pay you to include their business within your podcast episodes. Let's talk about those strategies. Let's talk about those things that you can use to monetize your podcast. Because like we keep saying, we want you to have a successful podcast career. So we have to include monetizing your podcast so that you can get paid to do what you love to do and entertain the people that you love to entertain. Now from there, it's good to say that we'll be talking about setting a date to start your podcast. I mean, we've talked about what your podcast is going to consist of, what type of podcast you're going to be creating, who the audience is, what type of branding elements you're going to be using, what type of frequency you're going to have with dropping your episodes, what type of show format you're going to have. Let's monetize your podcast. What type of branding elements are going to be included? Now we're down to the nitty gritty. Like, let's get started. Let's stop putting off starting your podcast and let this year, this now, be the time that you start your podcast. And we're going to put a date on it. So once we handle all the conversation within the consultation, we're going to be putting a date on it. We're going to get started with your podcast. We're going to come up with a good frequency of recording your podcast so it's not too much strain on you or the people involved. And we're going to make sure that you have a top-notch production. So let's get started. The link's down in the description. Visit the website, email us, call us, text us. If you have any questions, let's start the conversation, because the sooner we start the conversation, the sooner we can get started with your podcast, not just your podcast career, but your successful podcast career. Because now's the time to get in the game. Get in the game now and do what you love to do. Use that gift of conversation that you have. Use that gift of gab. Use that personality that everyone loves, and make your mark in this podcast era, this podcast career. And we're here to help you do that. Remarkable 6 Studios. I am GS Remarkable. I'll talk to you soon.